Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the Neuroscience edition of 5-Minute Psych. In this 5-minute segment, we'll look at the cerebral cortex. We'll begin with an overview of the cerebral cortex, and then we'll look at the 4 lobes that are found in each hemisphere. In doing so, we'll also examine the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. The cerebrum is the largest area of the brain, responsible for higher-level mental activities like learning, thinking, and memory. The cerebrum is divided into 2 roughly equal halves called hemispheres that are very connected to each other through a thick band of white matter pathways called the corpus callosum. The cerebral cortex is the thin 3-millimeter outer layer of the cerebrum. It's made up primarily of cell bodies, 6 layers of cell bodies to be precise, but because these cell bodies are gray in color, the cerebral cortex is also known as the gray matter. Although the cerebral cortex is very thin, it's greatly convoluted, with roughly 2/3 of its surface hidden deep within the creases. This increases the surface area dramatically. In fact, if you could flatten out all the folds and creases, it would measure about 2.5 square feet. And these folds and creases aren't just random, but they're consistent across individuals. So much so that they're used to define the boundaries of the 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. For instance, one major groove is called the central sulcus, and it runs across the top of your head. Imagine if you stuck your sunglasses on top of your head, they would be right on top of your central sulcus. There are 4 lobes, but keep in mind that each lobe appears in each hemisphere, so technically we have 8 lobes. The occipital lobe is at the very back of the head and contains the primary visual cortex, which processes visual information. The temporal lobe is located on the sides of your head, behind your ears. It contains the primary auditory cortex, which processes auditory information. The temporal lobe is also involved in certain aspects of language processing, as well as visual object recognition. The parietal lobe is above the occipital lobe, on top of your head, but towards the back. It contains the somatosensory cortex, which is an area of the cortex right behind the central sulcus, where the sense of touch is processed. However, the parietal lobe also deals with regulating visual input and keeping track of the body's position in space. Finally, the frontal lobe is located at the very front and top of the brain. It contains the primary motor cortex, which is an area just in front of the central sulcus, where all of our muscles are controlled from. The frontal lobe also contains the prefrontal cortex, located in front of the primary motor cortex. The prefrontal cortex is involved in many highly complex cognitive activities, such as planning, reasoning, and decision-making. It's the last area to reach adult levels, developing into the early 20s. The primary motor cortex controls the movement of our muscles and is laid out in a pattern often represented by a motor homunculus. What this means is that if we mapped out how much of the primary motor cortex is devoted to controlling each part of the body, we'd find that the parts of the body that are able to move with the greatest precision, like the mouth and hands, have more cortical space than regions that are not capable of such fine motor control, like the foot. Coincidentally, the somatosensory cortex, which lies just on the other side of the central sulcus, is also represented by a sensory homunculus, in which parts of the body that are the most sensitive to touch, like the mouth and fingers, have more cortical space than places on the body that are less sensitive, like the back. Another obvious feature that shows up when we map the motor and sensory cortex is that they each have a topographic organization, where adjacent areas of the body are represented by adjacent neurons in the cortex. So suppose you found one neuron that controls movement in the 3rd finger, the neighboring neuron would likely control movement in the 2nd or 4th finger. Well, we just looked at an overview of the cerebral cortex. Then we discussed the 4 lobes, and finally, we looked at the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. Now, aren't you glad you had 5 minutes?